Hi, this is Paul. I'm going to be talking to Richard Rowland in about a half hour, but I thought I'd have time to make a quick little video. Again, I'm going to be on vacation for about 3 weeks, and so video production, who knows what it's going to be. My wife is like, just don't stop making videos because you're on vacation. They'll just be different videos. Most of them probably be in the membership section, but I don't know. Every time I go on vacation, I've never been to Italy. We're there with the whole family. We've got a wedding to do, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah. But I wanted to talk about I got a picture of both of them. I wanted to talk about the Louise Perry, Elizabeth Oldfield conversation that dropped. Now, I Louise Perry, I think, is one of both Louise and Elizabeth are two of the, I think, most important voices in, let's say, the corner Vista. I don't know that they're in the corner, but they're sort of, looking how the corner looks out. They're always often talking about the kinds of things that we're talking about in the corner. And so I am a Substack supporter of hers, so I get the whole podcast, and I'm really happy that the podcast uses Pocket Casts app because it works really well on my car, which is really nice because that's where I listen to a lot of stuff if I'm driving around, so it's got to work with Android Auto. Anyway, I want to say a few things about this clip I'm going to play, and again, I've pulled out a clip, and so it's about 11 minutes long, and the whole thing's going to run. The whole conversation was great. There's an interesting section about parenting. I thought one of the most interesting sections is, again, behind the paywall, where they sort of dig into Tom Holland's thesis a little bit more. But on the video that I posted this morning, or at least let out of No Wait No Ads out to the full channel this morning, of Elizabeth Oldfield talking to Peter Hitchens, it was so funny. I laughed really hard at the end of that video when Peter Hitchens is, this stiff upper lip British curmudgeon, and Elizabeth Oldfield's like, I'm a roll on the floor charismatic. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I caught Christian Golden was talking to someone. I don't remember who he was talking to. I don't even remember where it was, but Christian often feels bad because he feels like I don't have respect for charismatics, or I dump on charismatics. Now, I do sometimes poke fun at smoke machines and skinny jeans, but it's really hard. We spoke in our Sunday morning estuary. We had a great Sunday morning estuary estuary meeting this last Sunday. It was awesome. We just had a small group, about 7-8 of the real hardcore regulars, and we really got into some stuff. It was awesome. But part of the things that I actually talked about in that video was the weird way in which the Paul Vanderklay that people sort of in a transjective way sort of meet online is disconnected from the Paul Vanderklay as he sort of really is. And one of these things is about worship, because I know I'm in this Orthodox space, and I know this whole space is kind of going Anglican, Catholic, Latin Mass, Catholic, Orthodox, all that stuff. And I know people are like, well, yeah, if Paul didn't have living stones, he'd go Orthodox. And the truth is, I'm way more charismatic than that. If it was just me, myself, and living stones went away, and there were no employment or vocational linkages or limitations on where I would go to church, I would probably be in a black church or in a Pentecostal church. And if there were no sort of theological, because theologically I'm not really a Pentecostal, I'm actually Reformed. My formative years at Madison Square Christian Reformed Church in Grand Rapids, and then of course Northside and Patterson. Northside wasn't very charismatic, but my formative years, I had 6 years both in membership and leadership at Madison Square in Grand Rapids, and I love charismatic worship. And the Freddie and Paul show should be a tell, because if you don't know that I am really very comfortable with a lot of chaos that makes a lot of other people uncomfortable, just look at my office. I had a homeless guy who would bring chaos to this thing outside in front of my church for 10 years. And it really didn't bother me, but I just sort of had to keep a lid on it for the neighbors and for my members of the church and anything. I'm super comfortable with a lot of chaos. I guess that comes with high and openness. So, when Christian Golden and says, well, I think Paul is really down on the charismatics. It's like, no, you don't understand. I'm one of you. I really am. Temperamentally, that's how I am. And, today on Twitter, Jonathan Peugeot posted pictures of his crowning ceremony and was like, what's that about? So I had to look it up and found a description of it, and it's like how they don't even know the right words to use, but basically how they bless the wedding or bless the marriage or something like that. But and I think it's just beautiful. I think it's just totally cool. But I'm the kind of guy who right out of seminary went up into the woods in the Dominican Republic and was with Haitians who would, thrash around in the water when they got baptized. And I thought it was cool. Other missionaries thought it was, I had one good friend who was a missionary. He'd get into the water and make them stop. And I just would just watch and think, oh, this is so cool. It's just how I am. And so, it was so funny watching our atheist church audit friend visiting the Orthodox, and where I've got a ton of respect and I'm super interested in it, but in terms of how I am, I mean, if you want to sort of watch me go to sleep, yeah, and that's the funny thing, because in some ways, I'm much more the crazy church than this. I like churches. I'm going to see beautiful, amazing cathedrals in Italy. I'm so looking forward to that, and I love the symbolism, and I would love to have a pocket Jonathan Peugeot or a pocket Cale Zeldin or a pocket Father Eric that I can go to these places and they could explain this and that and the meaning. And I'm so down for all of that. But when it comes to how I love to worship, I am somewhere between the frozen chosen of the Christian Reformed Church, which is basically low church but plain, and the Charismatics. And so, Jared sort of loved, really enjoyed Second Easter with the Orthodox. The part of the section, I'm going to talk about two sections. I got to watch how much I ramble. But part of the section I really loved of this conversation was how Elizabeth Oldfield and Louise Perry basically said, big sound, big box Christian megachurch worship with 5,000 people, with contemporary music and expressive and heartfelt. And yeah, I'm there for it. I just am. And so even though, yeah, sometimes it can get a little happy clappy. Sometimes some of the songs can be a little trite. I get that. I still have a theological mind when it comes to really my own personal preference where I connect in worship. It's much more close. It's much closer to the Charismatics. So yeah, I was just surprised when Christian Golden said that. So I'll drop that clip here.
That kind of charismatic bit of the church, which is frankly still where I feel most at home, does a lot of things well. It does a lot of I really do. Now I'm in my second naivete with the whole thing, and I pray in tongues again, and I lie on the floor. I'm a full blown weirdo. But what that space gives me is a lot of a sense of space for emotional processing and a lot of comfort with my embodiment, right? And is not scared of the full bandwidth of lived experience as a human being. But what it didn't do really is give me any sense of how to rigorously wrestle with these texts. And that tends to be what you get in the more contemplative or the more austere bits of the church. And that's sort of why I feel very comfortable being a mongrel. I want to just slide back and forth and around all these different tribes, because in some ways it's what we're for. It's what all good communities are for. We have different gifts and we are supposed to share them with each other and teach each other the bits that we don't already know ourselves.
Yes, you don't have to. I've actually spoken to lots of people who who worship in all the different ways, who will go to the contemporary style of church service and who will also go to the high church service and will go on retreat to abbeys and monasteries. And you're not required to do just one, I guess, unless you belong to a denomination which really doesn't offer anything else. But it seems that a lot of people their spiritual lives are enriched by doing it all.
Yeah, and I think if you resist the sort of tribal lie that any one of us or any community has got it right, that like knows everything and everyone else is wrong, which does creep in places, I think probably does all in human institutions, really want to think we've got it right and other people have got it wrong because that's how we steady ourselves. But if you can resist that, which you should be able to in this tradition, I believe, then yeah, you can just see it as this big, extraordinary family tree.
You took part in this debate recently for Unheard about whether or not there's a Christian revival happening, and I want to talk about that debate in a second because I thought it was very interesting. But one feature of this Christian revival that I've noted and which I don't much like, I mean, so to the extent that it's happening, right? I mean, I think it is true. Justin Brearley asserts, and I think he's right, that there's definitely among sort of public intellectuals, there seems to be a tugging back towards Christianity. And there are lots of high profile examples of people who have gone in that direction. Jordan Peterson famously, Nick Cave, Russell Brand, whoever you want to name. And I notice it also sort of among my peer group, people who work in media and, you know, elite professions, whatever. It does often come with quite a lot of vanity of small differences around denomination, I've noticed. People being quite discovering faith and then almost immediately discovering a deep commitment to one very particular interpretation. And one of the things that I like about your book is you don't do that. There isn't any kind of vanity around the boundaries between different denominations and where they disagree.
That's funny. I don't think I'd noticed that. There is obviously a sort of orthodox, you know, flowering that's happening amongst some of those converts. But if you hear someone like Martin Shaw talking about that, he visited loads of different places and would say, this is the one that fits me best. And there are questions that I have with it, but it is for my temperament and his kind of imaginative mythological, you know, formation. It's where he sits. There is definitely, and lots of people in different, you know, whether you've been a Marxist your whole life and then people convert to it or whatever, anyone who's been part of a kind of path and then other people are entering it know the phenomenon of the zeal of the convert and that like both kind of charming and refreshing and reassuring newness of people that are just discovering it, and also the way they can be a little bit bull in a china shop and you want to be like, it's all right, you know, calm down.
It's something that maybe I'm just describing myself because it's something that I noticed when I first started being pulled towards Christianity is I worried a lot about differences between different denominations and exactly what people thought about particular things, and thought maybe I need to decide. I need to sort of sit down with a spreadsheet and say, well, I suppose the Orthodox are probably right about this, but then maybe the evangelicals have a point about it or whatever. And it was partly and I did a lot of church shopping. I have probably been to 30 different churches or something like that over the last, 5 years. Every possible position on the high to low church, every size, every location, etc. And I basically learned to stop worrying about it and to choose, which may displease some listeners, I don't know, but I decided that it's not that important really for me. What's important is feeling at home in a church, and just as importantly, feeling that my family is at home in a church, you know, dragging along, deciding that actually I think that, say, the Latin Mass is the purest expression of Christian tradition. That may well be a defensible view, you know, I'm not commenting either way, but I have found trying to take my toddler to Latin Mass to be completely excruciating. And it's sort of like, well, do we torture ourselves every Sunday by insisting on sort of liturgical purity? Or do we go to a church where actually my son enjoys himself?
Yeah,
and it feels really easy and comfortable.
I think it's so much about relationship. Like I did a Q&A episode of the podcast I host called The Sacred, and this came up a lot. This kind of like, I am feeling my way into this. Where do I start? Like, where should I go? Give me the answers. And I honestly, like, doctrinal differences are always going to be there. I'm not sure I've ever been in a church where I agree with everything that the leader thinks. Stylistic differences are not irrelevant. Like, if you cannot bear full chord worship music, don't go, because it will annoy you. And if you are someone like me who, in theory, likes high church liturgy, but actually is so distractible that I can get a little bit bored and my mind can drift, that somewhere where you actually kind of want to be feels good. And then, honestly, because I'm so much about the sort of distinction, one distinction you can make between religion and spirituality is religion is supposed to be collective. A lot of it is like, can I walk with these people? Can I learn to love them? Can I serve them? Can I be in community with them? Because it is in the community that I am formed and that I am changed. Like, do they seem welcoming? Do they care that I'm here? And therefore, do I want to be on this path with these people? And not, are they people that I naturally would have chosen as friends? Because that is not what you're looking for. But is there something about them that I find intriguing or could even trust? And that is my kind of key criteria, because it should be about community.
I have been so surprised in myself, and I have you to thank for this, for introducing me to the charismatic style of worship. Is that the best way of describing it? Yeah, the contemporary music, the hands in the air. I have so surprised myself by how much I like it, and how much it appeals to me, and how much my natural snobbishness has been successfully suppressed. And actually now I will. There's a lot of snobbishness around this, and I will.
Huge.
Yes, and I am so ready to go in and defend contemporary worship, which is so popular. Okay, like number one. I mean, looking globally at the attraction that charismatic worship styles clearly has, particularly for younger people. There's something there. You can't just dismiss this. And I also think just early Christians didn't sing Victorian hymns.
No.
Right?
No. And I'm not surprised that it's brought that out on you, because it brings it out at me. But I write in the book about how this kind of outbreaks of enthusiasm. So the word enthusiasm used to be much more narrowly about these kind of emotionally expressive forms of worship, because entheos obviously means filled with God. Like, expressive, emotional forms of worship have just been looked down on since the Enlightenment by intellectual men in and out of the church, and seen as the preserve of poor people, women, and people of colour, because they are obviously more credulous and irrational. And it just makes me want to be like, screw that. Like, that actually, as always with these kind of things, I'm like, and maybe that those groups understood something that the snobby intellectual elites actually need to know, that they would really benefit from a little bit of a cry and a hands in the air. There's something healthy is happening in that.
I mean, one of the really powerful things about Christianity as a human phenomenon is that it does work in a lot of different registers. It can be highly intellectual and contemplative and all of this, and it can also be highly emotional and raucous. And it can be understood by children. It can be understood by the cleverest people who've ever lived, and in different ways. Or understood is maybe the wrong word. It can be engaged with. And that seems to me to be a very important part of its power.
Yeah, and again, it's one of the things that makes it feel very radical. There's a sense in which the early Christians were illiterate, outsiders. That took a while for it to work its way into the corridors of power. And there's a lot about the shaming the wisdom of the wise, that our desire, our desire to keep things controllable by our intellect is sort of repeatedly challenged. There are moments of surrender required. But yeah, I feel very... Part of the reason I love it is I can read Rowan Williams and then I can sit next to an Iranian refugee in my church who does not speak English and has encountered this thing in this really like dribs and drabs piecemeal way that caused them to convert in their own country, even though they knew it would potentially end up with them being executed, and then flee across the entirety of Europe to get here and be in our church. And, you know, that my kids can see something in it. It really... If something was true, you would sort of hope that it worked like that.
Yeah.
Right?
Now, often what I do with a video is I make a transcript, and it's, of course, easier and easier to do that. And so, yeah, the latter part, I'm not going to violate the paywall. Louise Perry is pregnant. You know, she's having a baby. She's doing the right thing. I think they're having their second baby, maybe. I don't know. But, you know, gotta support. And her husband is involved in this, too. So gotta support him. Gotta support him having a baby. But there are a few things that I loved in there. Louise Perry called the Protestant Reformation Luther's big intervention, which I thought was really good. And they were talking about denominations and how, you know, denominations have sort of lined up propositionally. And that's true. But, I mean, part of what I've always suspected is that they're certainly lining up propositionally, but they're also lining up stylistically and along these other metrics. And apparently Louise Perry's mother is a Quaker, and so she talked about that. It was really an excellent conversation in terms of a lot of this stuff, and maybe I'll read some of it. Okay. And these are rough transcriptions, so they're probably not greatly word for word, and they're full of errors. But Luther's big intervention, sola scriptura, you say actually, you know, all Christians can access God's truth just through our own encounters with the Holy Spirit and with Scripture. I'm sure I have theologians listening who are going to be cross. But, you know, it isn't part of the wild. So they talked about how there is, again, a wildness. And so there certainly is, in some sense, a rewilding. But the rewilding is happening much more in some of the intellectual registers, because Christianity has remained wild in the other classes. Now, and this is something that I talk about a lot, where so much of the stuff that we're paying attention to is happening sort of at the intelligentsia, elite, owners of certain realms of society. And because a lot of this has not changed much down in the working class areas. You know, part of the reason I always use Dog Bark's music for my branding and from my Friday live streams. No live stream this Friday, by the way. Probably no live streams for the month of July. Sorry, it's just going to be the way it is. I love blues. I grew up so deeply impacted by the African American community. My father's church was very African American, although they were often African Americans who were looking for an alternative from the black church. So, and it was just a nice nuance between Louise Perry talking about, on one hand, the Quakers, because the Quakers, they don't have clergy, but then a little later she sort of backtracked and said, but you know, the Quakers sometimes lose their way because they don't quite hold on to the Bible. And so, I mean, it was just a really tremendous conversation. I'll get to a little bit more of it. So they're discussing Tom Holland's thesis. Louise Perry says, well, it's always hard to read transcriptions, especially AI transcriptions, because when you actually make a transcription yourself, you usually clean up the spoken language, which doesn't really translate well into text, and then you sort of automatically clean it up, because often I would make transcriptions by hand, which is actually a really good way to get to know what they're saying. It's sort of like the discipline of translation. But when I use an AI transcription, all the roughness is in there. I worry the Church of England is not as much as Quaker, but as really vulnerable to the political fashion. That's another theme that went through there, that both Louise Perry and Elizabeth Oldfield are trying to get beyond political fashion, because these fashions are running through, and they're running through quickly. It makes the point of Rod Dreher, has a point that remaining Christian in the face of deep hostility to Christianity isn't obviously a novel problem for Christians. Far from it. Christians have faced much deeper adversity and persecution than they do now. Well, I would say the kinds of adversity that Christians face now is not overt necessarily like it was, let's say, in a deeply polarized culture war that turns hot war, but is much more subtle. And then Elizabeth Oldfield disagrees. I'm not sure I agree. I think that we have an institutional power. We really get flabby. I'm gonna try not to sound super goth, but my reading of the new is to take up your cross and follow me. Like, do these radical acts, turn the other cheek, love your enemies, feed the poor, lay down your life for your friends. And what's interesting about Elizabeth Oldfield is that a lot of people, I think, will listen to Elizabeth Oldfield through a political lens and say, oh, she's a lefty, and part of her is, but she's a charismatic lefty. And a big part of the problem of seeing the religious through a political lens is the religious truth on the ground is just far more complex. That's true of the mainline churches in America. And I often find exactly this problem listening to Brits watching the American scene through the lens of American media. Because the lens of American media keeps saying, well, it's the conservative evangelicals versus the atheists. And it's like, well, you forget the Christian mainline, and you don't actually understand the subtleties of the Christian mainline. Even though, I'm not going to say the subtleties, I'll say the diversity within the Christian mainline. Now, that keeps getting wrung out in some ways as mainline churches seem intent on, I don't know what happened with PC USA in terms of their getting rid of their conscience clause with respect to LGBTQ affirming. I'll have to see what happened there. But it's always so much more complex and so much more nuanced. So Elizabeth Oldfield just sort of pushes back on Louise Perry and says, well, keep Christianity weird, keep Christianity strange, keep it turn the other cheek and do all of those things. And actually, this is wrong here. Elizabeth was still talking. But then they sort of turn around again, and Louise Perry says, yeah, but remember, we're living in a time, a la Tom Holland's narrative, that our sensibilities have been fundamentally reshaped by Christianity, and our attachment of these sensibilities to Christianity has been disconnected, sort of washed through secularism. And then Louise Perry goes a little bit further into how Tom Holland, and that was also behind the paywall of Louise Perry's conversation with Tom Holland. Tom Holland is a little bit more optimistic about the fact that even the critics of Christianity still now are forefronting methods that came through Christianity. And so Tom has this super interesting, nuanced sort of, every time you dig deeper, you find more Christian levels. And Louise Perry is a little more anxious about that, a little more nervous. But then again, Tom Holland and Louise Perry are different people. And Tom Holland's a man. Men tend to be lower in anxiety. Women tend to be a little higher in anxiety, according to Jordan Peterson, for the well-being of their children. So, again, it was just a super interesting conversation. And it would be really nice to sort of take the paywall part of the Louise Perry. So Louise, if you're listening, you could make a whole nother video out of that. Take the paywall part of the Louise Perry conversation, put it next to the paywall part of the Tom Holland conversation. I'm sorry, the Elizabeth Oldfield conversation, the Tom Holland conversation, because they really sort of dovetailed nicely. And you can see how this Christian civilizational stuff is just continuing to sort of work under the surface. And it's pretty clear that Louise Perry and Elizabeth Oldfield are sort of thinking about that. And I think that's one of the areas that, that of distributed cognition that the corner just sort of keeps churning on. And of course, the corner is much more American than Louise Perry, Elizabeth Oldfield, or Tom Holland. So anyway, again, it would be lovely to listen to it all, but I'm not going to do that because I'm not going to violate the paywall. But get behind the paywall. It's $7 a month, or it's like $79 a year, or something like that. And they're both the paywall section of the Tom Holland conversation, the paywall section of the Elizabeth Oldfield conversation. They were both, in my opinion, quite worth it. So I'm talking to Richard Rowland in 7 minutes, so I should take a break and get some things ready. But leave a comment.
Yeah. Get away! Get away! Get away, chilly darling! I wanna cross over and see my Lord. Get away! Get away! Get away! Oh, chilly Jordan, wanna cross over and see my Lord. Well, I promised the Lord if He would set me free, well, I'd go until I find out what the end might be. Well, one day, I was walking along, yeah. I heard a voice, but I saw no one. The voice I heard sounded so sweet, child. It came down from the crown of my head to the soles of my feet. Well, get away. Get away. Get back, Chilly Jack. Wanna cross over to see my Lord. Well, one of these days, and it won't be long, you're gonna look for me, I'll be gone. Yeah, just a few more risings and setting of the sun. This old battle fought and victory won. Well, you know, friends I used to love so dear, they gone on to glory and left me here. My feet get cold, my eyes shut, my body's been chilled by the hand of death. You know, tongue glued to the roof of my mouth, folded hands across my breast. You don't have to worry about the way I felt. Sonny man told me he'd be right there. Yeah, my buddy Wings of Love, carrying my soul to heavens up above. They tell me Jordan is deep and wide, but I told my mother I'd see her on the other side. Get away. Get away. Oh, get back. Chili Jack.